I used to think love could survive anything. Distance, time, even betrayal. I believed that when two people promised forever, it meant something. But now I know sometimes forever is just a countdown to destruction. Her name was Claire. And she was my entire world. We met in college. She was studying graphic design. I was buried in business and numbers. She had that kind of smile that made you forget where you were, soft, unassuming, but dangerous in how it made you want to stay. We moved in together after graduation, got an apartment with creaky floors and windows that whistled in the wind. We didn't care. We were in love, broke but invincible. I remember the night I asked her to marry me. It wasn't perfect. I didn't have money for some grand gesture. We were eating Chinese takeout on the floor, and I hid the ring inside a fortune cookie. She laughed until she cried. When she said yes, it felt like the universe finally got something right. For a few years, life was good, simple, honest. She found a job at a marketing firm, and I started working for a logistics company that handled corporate imports. It was stressful, but it paid well. We talked about buying a house, having kids, maybe a dog. Then everything changed. It started with little things. Late nights at the office, client dinners, her phone always face down. I told myself she was just working hard, that she was building something for us. I didn't want to be that jealous husband who checked her messages or followed her car, but love makes you blind. And blindness always comes with a price. One night, she came home at 1 a.m., makeup smudged, hair undone. I asked her if everything was okay. She smiled, said she and her team were celebrating a big client win. But when I hugged her, she smelled like whiskey and someone else's cologne. Something in me broke. Not loudly, just a quiet, invisible snap inside my chest. I started noticing patterns. The way she locked her phone. How she'd flinch when I entered the room during a call. How she'd get defensive if I asked too many questions. The lies got smoother, practiced. Until one day, she slipped. Her smartwatch buzzed while she was in the shower. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I saw the preview of a message from a contact saved as C. It read, "Last night was amazing. I can still taste you." My world went silent. I didn't yell, didn't throw anything. I just sat there on the bed, staring at that single line of text. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the watch. When she came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, she saw my face and froze. "Who's C?" I asked. Her eyes darted, panic flashing behind them. Then came the worst part. She smiled. A small, broken smile. "Alex," she whispered. "Please, don't do this now." That was her defense. "Please, don't do this now. Not it's not what you think. Not I can explain. Just not now." I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and left. Walked for hours through the city until the sun came up. My phone buzzed with her messages, apologies, excuses, promises. By morning, I'd stopped reading them. I didn't go home for 3 days. When I finally did, she was gone. Half the closet empty. Her side of the bed cold. A note on the table, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. You deserve better." Better. That word haunted me. Weeks passed, then months. Everyone told me to move on. That these things happen. That time heals. But time doesn't heal, it hides the wound under new skin, waiting for the right moment to reopen. And then, one night, I saw her again. I was at a friend's engagement party, ironic. I know. And there she was, standing across the room. She looked radiant, glowing, like someone who'd never shattered another person's life. And beside her was him, the man from the messages. Chris, her boss. He had his arm around her waist, casual, confident, like he'd won a prize. She caught my eyes for a split second and froze. For a moment, guilt flickered. Then she looked away, smiling at him like nothing had ever happened. That was when I decided I wasn't going to scream, or cry, or beg for closure. No, I was going to build something much more permanent. Something that would hurt not just her but everything she'd built with him. Because if she could rebuild her life on my ruin, then I could build my revenge on hers. I spent the next 6 months studying him. His habits, his career, his weaknesses. He was smart, but arrogant. A man who thrived on attention, who needed to be admired. He and Claire had started a new marketing firm together, C&H Creative. It was doing well, fast growing, well funded. I learned everything: their investors, their clients, their secrets. And then I created a new identity. Under a different name, I became a potential client of a small tech company looking for a marketing partnership. I played the part perfectly: polite, ambitious, naive. They bought it instantly. The first time I sat across from them in their new office, my heart almost gave out. Claire didn't recognize me at first. My hair was shorter, beard grown, voice lower. When she finally realized who I was, her face went pale. Chris, on the other hand, smiled, extended his hand like a snake. "Alex, right. Great to finally meet you," I smiled back. Likewise. It was the calmest I had ever sounded, because inside, I was already planning how to burn his empire down. You learn a strange thing about grief: it can be sculpted into patience. The right that followed Claire's betrayal slowly hardened into a tool. I sharpened it with routines. I learned to sleep less and watch more. I mapped her life like a city map of the shortcuts, the landmarks, the weak streetlights. Every habit became a scaffold for what I would build. My new name fit like a coat. I rented an apartment on the other side of town, opened accounts in a different bank, created a fake portfolio with a careful mix of real design campaigns and fabricated results. I didn't want to bluff with bravado. I wanted credibility. So I hired a freelancer to build a plausible website, paid for a few sponsored posts, and phoned a small PR agency to ask for introductions. By the time I walked into C&H Creative as a client, my story was as tidy as one of their pitch decks. They welcomed me with the warmth of people who thought they'd already won. Claire greeted me first, that same smile that had once made me forgive anything. Up close, her eyes had new lines, not from age, but from leaning into someone else's light. Chris was effusive, the kind of man who filled rooms with noise so he wouldn't have to face silence. He called me by my new name and joked about pioneering brands and authentic narratives. I nodded. I listened. I learned their rhythm. The first phase was simple, useful. I offered them a real contract. A mid-sized app company, modest budget, but high social traction. Real money, but not the kind that would make them greedy enough to skip due diligence. They took the contract, excited about the case study. I celebrated inwardly because their willingness to take money from me confirmed something: they trusted charm over caution. Trust is the softest soil for sabotage. You don't topple someone with one blow. You loosen bolts. I started leaving small, suggestive things in their path. I casually forwarded a draft that suggested a competitive firm was pitching a similar concept. A remark in a meeting about an investor who preferred disruption to stability. I seeded doubt like a gardener scattering seed. People who encourage risk also fear being risked upon. I watched them twitch when unfamiliar names drifted into conversation. Claire responded exactly how I expected. She hustled harder, smiled wider, posted more curated photos of late nights and creative rituals. She wanted the world to see her redeemed, luminous, untouchable. Chris swam with her tide, basking in the reflected glow. Their relationship, brittle as it was, ossified into a public performance of applause, accolades, the occasional trophy on their office shelf. The second phase was to fracture their performance into private friction. I cultivated allies inside C&H the old-fashioned way, by noticing people no one else bothered to notice. There was Mara, the account director, whose fingers were stained with all the unpaid overtime. She loved recognition more than money. There was Tomas, the junior creative, restless and hungry for credit. I courted them not with bribes, but with attention, coffee, thoughtful emails, small favors that seemed like friendship. People who feel seen make mistakes. They reveal what they hide. Mara confided her resentment one night over cheap wine. They take the credit and pass us the work, she said, voice thin. Tomas sent me drafts of campaigns that had been quietly edited to erase other people's contributions. I saved everything. I cataloged names and timestamps like a priest catalogs sins. Little by little, I built a dossier of the small cruelties that had kept C&H afloat: to missing credits, and paid overtime, favors traded for promotions. None of it was illegal, but together, it composed a portrait of exploitation, and exploitation, when exposed, corrodes trust. Then I began to manipulate the clients. This was delicate work. You can't just shout betrayal. You whisper it into the ear of someone with power. I reached out to two of their largest clients under the guise of curiosity, a product director at a retail chain and a founder at a competing tech startup. I didn't threaten. I offered options. I asked questions about the metrics they expected and the transparency they valued. I sent them innocuous summaries after meetings that highlighted inconsistencies in C&H's reporting, a slide missing a quarter's analytics, a campaign timeline that magically compressed. I made the gaps visible enough to alarm people who paid invoices with other people's money. It worked faster than I'd hoped. Clients began to ask for clearer deliverables. They requested third-party audits and tracking links. Suddenly, the select agency had relied upon snapped. Claire argued that the client was being bureaucratic. Chris mouthed reassurances in public and pivoted nervously in private. When budgets tightened, that's when people get afraid. The third phase was uglier, more intimate. I knew Claire's Achilles heel: pride. She attached her worth to the agency's reputation. If that reputation cracked just enough, she'd try to plaster it shut with decisions that made her look good now and damning later. So, I baited those decisions. I suggested a bold rebrand to one of their marquee clients, a move that would require aggressive timelines and offshore vendors. Claire loved it, the chance to be audacious, to steal headlines. She proposed the plan in a pitch with Chris, eyes shining. I had already lined up a vendor I'd researched, competent enough to deliver but sloppy with contracts, the sort that would accept verbal agreements and delay invoices. I fed Claire the vendor's portfolio and watched her sign the dotted line. When the vendor missed milestones, Claire's panic turned into blame. She called late-night emergency meetings, demanded sacrifices, and ordered her team to work weekends with the understated brutality of someone trying to save face. Tomas and Mara complained about unpaid extra hours. A few said they felt manipulated into working for free because the founder had trusted them. The culture turned brittle, morale snapping in places I'd already mapped out. One quiet morning, I did something I'd rehearsed for weeks. I sent an anonymous email to the client's procurement officer. Attached were screenshots, internal memos that showed the vendor's invoices had been routed through a shell company before reaching the agency, and an internal chat where someone joked about creative accounting. The email asked polite, non-accusatory questions. It didn't scream corruption. It whispered negligence and impropriety. The client called a meeting. They requested access to the invoices and the vendor contracts. The procurement officer, a meticulous woman named Gloria, sensed inconsistency and, driven by duty, dug deeper. When she found the shell routing, her lawyer's voice on the phone suddenly dropped its casual cadence. "We need records," she told Claire. "We need transparency." I watched Claire's face closely during that conference call. Pride is a fragile vessel. When it's punctured, people start to flail. She sounded smaller on the phone, the bright performance replaced by an urgent, pleading pitch about transition glitches and vendor miscommunication. Chris tried to interject with corporate language for fiduciary responsibility, revised timelines, but his words hit like too late parachutes. The board of the retail client demanded a forensic audit. That phrase, forensic audit, felt heavy in my hands, like a weapon I'd forged carefully from long days of rage. For the first time in months, Claire's eyes met mine across a crowded room, and something like recognition flashed there. Not the recognition of the woman who'd once loved me, but of a chess player recognizing an opposing move. With audits come subpoenas, and with subpoenas come exposure. The vendor invoices traced back to an offshore entity with inadequate documentation. When the audit team requested employee timesheets, the agency's sloppy record-keeping was exposed. Names that had been edited off headlines reappeared in internal memos. Tomas's drafts were time-stamped in a way that proved he'd created work the agency had claimed for themselves. Mara's overtime logs matched the nights of major wins the partners later touted as singular achievements. The PR team at C&H scrambled to contain the narrative. Claire composed notes about restructuring and renewed transparency. Chris drafted a public statement about growth pains and learning moments. They tried to couch everything in terms that would soothe investors and clients. But soothing requires a steady hand. Theirs were shaking. I didn't celebrate when the first client asked for refunds. That wasn't the point. The point was to watch the structure that supported her pride sag. It wasn't enough to dismantle their business. I wanted the rubble to be visible so that every passerby could trace the collapse to the people who'd built illusions on other people's labor. There was a cost. Revenge is a currency that demands you spend pieces of yourself. I had to make myself present in the agency's orbit without being seen. I had to befriend people who trusted me and then push them toward choices that would expose their leaders. There were nights I lay awake thinking of Claire in bed with him, a simple human thought that tasted like ash. There were mornings I walked past their office and felt something like grief for what had been, not for her, but for the life we'd promised. Grief and rage braided together until I could no longer tell them apart. The final part of this setup was to ensure the collapse would be public and irreversible. I crafted a packet of documents redacted just enough to avoid legal peril for me, but precise enough to invite scrutiny. It contained vendor contracts, internal memos about credit allocation, and a spreadsheet where bonuses were redistributed in ways that suggested pay-to-play favors. I didn't plant the packet where it screamed. I slipped it into an open drive in the agency's shared folder with a timestamp that matched an actual audit query. I watched from a nearby cafe as the client's procurement officer opened the file and her eyebrows climbed into alarm. From there, the dominoes fell. The client pulled out. Social chatter turned from praise to skepticism. An industry blog picked up the story, not with a howl but with a careful and pitying examination. The agency's investors started calling more frequently. Claire's Instagram, a curated, bright, filled with comments asking for transparency. The applause that had once followed her began to stutter. On the day the client publicly announced they were terminating the contract and seeking restitution, Claire sat in the office as the inbox filled with polite but pointed emails. She cried once in the bathroom, a sharp, surprised sound, and then composed herself with practiced composure. I wanted to approach her then, to say something, an apology, a taunt, maybe a question about how she felt, but I only watched. I had come this far by staying outside. To step in now would be to contaminate the work, to weld my motives to the narrative. I had to remain the ghost that pushed the pieces until they fell. That night, as the city lights blurred through rain-streaked windows, I allowed myself a small, private victory, the satisfaction of watching her empire wobble. It wasn't the end, not yet. There were still lawsuits to come, explanations to be manufactured, and perhaps a man who might attempt to rebuild by scapegoating someone else. But the foundations were shaken, and in my hands, that tremor felt like progress. Revenge had become a practice of patience and cruelty, a series of small, clinical acts disguised as misfortune. I had learned how to unspool a life thread by thread without anyone noticing at first, and as the agency scrambled, and their faces grew thin with stress, I felt the first warmth of something I'd been missing for months: control. But control is not peace. It is a mirror that only shows you how far you're willing to go. I was not sure, in those midnight hours, whether I was saving myself or simply becoming someone capable of the same quiet betrayals. All I knew was that the next move would decide whether this was justice or merely a better constructed ruin. When something built on lies starts to fracture, it never does so neatly. It shudders, then cracks, and the pieces fall without courtesy. The client's forensic team dug like hounds. They asked questions that were small and precise until the answers became impossible to contain. I watched from the margins while their world, Claire's world, unspooled in a way I'd only dared to imagine. It began with a voicemail from Gloria, the procurement officer. I wasn't supposed to have her number, but I had paid attention to details, names, rhythms, the way important people repeated minor facts like mantras. The voicemail was curt: "We've found inconsistencies. We'll be calling your people in for interviews. This will go public." She didn't know I had been the one to set the plan. Hearing her voice, calm and professional, felt like a vindication and a blade at once. Court papers followed. The client filed for restitution and demanded records. The industry blog, which had first asked questions, now ran a piece that named C&H Creative in a story about agency ethics. He headline rippled across feeds, and with it came hot takes and old grudges. People began to send me messages, some supportive, some venomous. Anonymous emails accused me of playing God. An old college friend called me reckless and then hung up when I tried to explain. The moral ledger felt heavier than I'd imagined. Inside the agency, the atmosphere turned corrosive. Claire moved like someone navigating a house collapsing around her, methodical, frantic. Every action trying to hold something that could no longer be supported. Meetings moved from confident brainstorms to damage control. Chris became defensive in a way that suited him badly. His usual bravado curdled into blame. He organized emergency calls with investors and tried to spin the audit as an overreaction. Spin only works when there's oxygen for it to ride. Oxygen was gone. Employees whispered in corridors. Tomas avoided eye contact. Mara stopped answering her phone between 9 and 5. I saw the human cost in small places, coffee cups left half-finished. Shoes under desks that weren't moved. The way someone used a marker to cross out a presentation slide and then hesitated before throwing it away. These were the micro-echoes of a larger collapse. The sound they made was a human thing: fear, shame, and the practical panic of needing to explain to a spouse why the weekly paycheck might be smaller. Then came the deposition days. Legal rooms smelled like paper and stale air. I sat in the gallery and watched Claire take the stand. She was composed at first, Roy's steady, practiced lines about oversight and human error, but the lawyers are precise surgeons. They poke at nerves and wait for reflex. They produce timelines, emails, drafts. They read Tomas's original copy and then read the published version. They read vendor contracts that made the routing of fees look creative at best. She faltered on a question about who had final sign-off on creative credits. A tiny, involuntary twitch in her jaw gave away something raw. You don't rehearse the texture of remorse the way you rehearse a presentation. The jury watched. The reporters took notes. I felt nothing and everything at once. Victory braided tightly with a sharp, bitter emptiness. Chris tried a counterattack. He called an emergency client summit and presented a glossy remediation plan: refunds, audits, new governance. It was all theater, but theater costs money and attention. He attempted to isolate the problem, to point at one or two employees as the culprits and label them rogue. He suggested a scapegoat. That move landed with a dull thud. People smell scapegoating as easily as they smell smoke, and a few team members quietly resigned rather than be the next to be crushed. There were other, uglier pushes. An anonymous smears surfaced online about me, my alleged ulterior motives, suggestions that I'd orchestrated the whole scandal to claw my way back into relevance. The smear made the rounds on message boards and in the DMs of journalists who hadn't yet decided which side to favor. Someone had dug up one of my early freelance pieces under my old name and attached it to an opinion piece about revenge narratives. The narrative tried to rewrite me as the villain. It was an expected counterpunch, and yet the first time it hit my inbox I felt a strange, unfamiliar panic. The machine could turn on anyone. Weeks blurred into a pattern: depositions, resignations, investor meetings, and one particularly brutal board confrontation. The retail client convened an emergency review with their legal team in tow. Their counsel pointed to the offshored vendor and the shell routing, and they asked blunt questions about who in C&H had the authority to approve such arrangements. Claire's answers were measured but defensive. At one point she looked directly at me. The look was raw, something between accusation and plea. I kept my face neutral. I had taught myself the expression of someone who had nothing to lose. Outside work, other parts of my life started to fray. My sister texted less. My mother's voice over the phone was gentler but accompanied by worry. "You don't have to do this," she said. There must be another way. The way my mother said it made me think I was making a terrible mistake. And for a sliver of an hour I considered walking away. But the thought of walking away felt like letting a person who'd built a life on my ruin continue unchecked. So I stayed, even as my back ached with the weight of another person's collapse. The pressure had practical consequences too. A week after the deposit started, someone broke into my car and rifled through the glove box. They left it messy, a message intended more for intimidation than gain. I called the police. They took the report, asked perfunctory questions, and left. It was a small thing on a list of escalations, but it crystallized the danger. This was no longer a corporate game. People were willing to get close enough to my life to scare me. The night the agency announced layoffs, the office felt like a funeral home robbed of grace. Claire walked the floor, shaking hands, trying to look steady. People packed boxes with pens and plants and cheap art, their faces a map of humiliation. Tomas hugged me in a moment that felt both sincere and desperate. "I never wanted to be part of this," he said. "We were used." His voice cracked in a way that made me want to step in and tell the truth. But the truth had become a weapon I had to hold at arm's length. As the fall continued, legal teams on both sides began to trade threats. Chris told investors I was a saboteur, that I'd played a role in manufacturing the scandal. Ethan, no, not Ethan. That was from the last life. Chris's voice was sharp in conference calls as he apologized and pivoted and tried to salvage his image. Lawyers wrote cease and desist letters. I received one addressed to me by my assumed name, warning of defamation and malicious interference. It was the first time in months I felt fear bleed into the edges of my resolve. The letter was a warning and an invitation. If they could prove my involvement, the consequences would be severe. I won't pretend the fear didn't change the calculus. I started to double-check the steps I'd taken, to burn breadcrumbs and clean logs, to remind myself of legal boundaries I had no desire to cross. Revenge had to be surgical, not reckless. There was a line I was careful not to cross: explicit fabrication, blackmail, threats. Those were the kinds of moves that turned personal pain into criminal exposure. I had sworn to myself I would not become that. And yet sometimes the line blurred. When a journalist called and asked if I'd leaked the vendor packet, a part of me wanted to say yes, partly to claim ownership of the narrative, partly to force the world to confront the truth. But my lawyer advised quiet. The world, I learned, has room for many truths. You must choose the one that keeps you breathing. Then spooling reached its apex with a public hearing that felt like a stage set, microphones, cameras, and a panel of experts who spoke in tones that made everything sound inevitable. Claire testified under oath. For the first time since this began, I saw her as she was when we were young, raw, frightened, human. She answered questions with brittle honesty. She admitted to errors in judgment, to trusting the wrong people, to wanting the spotlight in a way that had blinded her to consequence. She did not confess to malice. She spoke of ambition and fear and of a moment where pride outpaced principle. Her testimony was not absolution. It was not even a full apology. But it was something more dangerous. It was human. The headlines the next morning were messy and sympathetic in turns. Some called her reckless. Others called her a casualty of a hyper-competitive industry. Chris's name appeared less. He hid behind legalese and investor assurances. The narrative split, as narratives do, into shards that fit different audiences. For some, Claire would remain a villain. For others, a cautionary tale. For me, the hearing did not settle the ache. I expected triumphant satisfaction, something bright and final. Instead, I felt a strange, sobering exhaustion. I had wanted her to fall, yes, but I hadn't wanted to watch the people around her, some of them decent, get burned too. The truth had teeth, and it bit everyone. As night fell and the city slept, I sat alone on the fire escape outside my apartment and watched lights blink in other windows. Below, someone laughed on the sidewalk. Above, a plane cut a pale line across the sky. The campaign of exposure had worked. Clients had left, investors had frozen lines, and C&H had become a cautionary whisper in the industry. But in achieving that, I had also become a man who knew how to pull strings. That knowledge sat in my gut like a stone. Somewhere, Claire was starting to rebuild her life in small, quieter ways. She posted fewer curated photos and fewer success stories. I saw through the small windows of social media moments that suggested reflection. Whether those moments were sincere or strategic, I could not say. What I could say was this: the world had altered both of us. The cost had been paid in dollars and dignity, and in private nights where former lovers stared at ceiling paint and asked themselves what had really been lost. The next phase, I knew, would not be about public spectacle. It would be quieter legal maneuvers, settlement talks, and perhaps a reckoning at a place that had nothing to do with headlines, the small, private decisions people make when no one is watching. I also knew one more thing, a truth that felt heavier with each passing day: revenge is rarely the end of a story. It is a hinge. What swings after the door closes is the thing that truly defines you. So I stayed ready. I tightened the parts of my life that could be tightened. I tried to sleep more, called my sister to check in, and sent Mara a message of support that I hoped didn't look performative. And in the hollow, quiet hours, I wondered whether control had simply been replaced by a quieter, Deeper longing to be whole again, not by destroying what destroyed me, but by building something that did not need the ruin of another. That question whether I could rebuild without another's collapse would be the test of the man I had become. The hearings had hollowed the agency, but hollowing isn't the same as finishing. It's a long, slow building, and people get tired before truth does. By the time autumn bled into winter, the legal teams were engaged in a kind of strategic attrition, subpoenas, depositions, and discovery requests that read like pursuit prayers. Every doc request felt like a scalpel finding another seam. They offered settlements first. Lawyers prefer deals to drama. Deals close books and limit print. Claire's counsel reached out through channels to polish to be casual. "We can resolve this quietly," they wrote, offering a number meant to hush up the worst of it. There was anger at the thought of buyouts, of shame bought with checks, but there was also the practical arithmetic of survival, payroll, rent, the basic human math of mouths to feed. Mara called me one night and said, quiet and desperate, "If Claire takes their deal, what happens to us?" She didn't ask for sympathy, only a verdict. I could have let them buy their silence. It would have been efficient. It would have saved lives from the crash I'd engineered. But efficiency isn't what had kept me awake the year prior. It was the ache to unmake the thing that hadn't made me, to force the cost of their deceit into the open ledger. So, I refused the comfortable morality of settlements. I wanted public accounting, not private insurance. That decision made me colder in ways I hadn't anticipated. People I'd comforted in corridors Tomas, Mara started to look at me with a new wariness, as if I might one day ask them to step off a cliff for my cause. They were right to be wary. I had become a catalyst, and catalysts burn things faster than anyone expects. Chris, sensing the walls closen, got mean. The man who'd once smiled his way around resistance started playing hardball. He leveraged whispered connections with investors, arranged confident legal notices suggesting counterclaims, and hired a private investigator to dig into my life. The investigator's first report came in a midnight package, photos of me leaving cafes, notes about who I'd called, timestamps of when I'd been in public. It was meant to intimidate. It made my skin crawl. Then came the call that changed the tone from corporate to personal. My sister's voice on the phone was thin. "They came to Mom's house," she said, and for a second I could hear nothing else. "Two men asked questions about you. They said they were friends of Claire's." Mom was scared. The Midwestern house where my mother kept her begonias and Sunday papers suddenly felt exposed. People had moved past corporate games and touched my family. I went to my mother that night, sat at her kitchen table while she poured tea with hands that trembled. She gave me a look I'd gotten since I was a child, disappointment tempered with a fierce, inexplicable loyalty. "You don't have to finish this," she said, placing a napkin between us like a truce. "You can stop and be the man I raised." Her voice broke on the last word. Mothers always make everything smaller and more human. For 3 nights I almost stopped. I let myself imagine a life where the worst was behind me, where Claire moved on, where clients settled, where I filed away the rage like an old coat. But the thought of waking up and pretending I hadn't watched my own life be auctioned off to a narrative built on lies felt like a betrayal to myself. So I went back to the ledger. I turned my attention to Chris because he was both the architect of the new life Claire built and the man whose arrogance made his fall possible. He'd hidden whole pieces of their operation behind plausible boardroom language and opaque vendor agreements. If I tore his scaffolding apart, the agency's house of cards would look unmistakable, not a tragedy of ambition, but a deliberate pattern of deceit. The plan was surgical. I cultivated an ally in the most unlikely place, a mid-level accountant from a consultancy that had handled some of C&H's offshore routing. He was practical, exhausted, and had a conscience worn thin by the constancy of small frauds. I bought him coffee and listened to his grievances. He told me about misreported line items, about phantom vendors that existed only on paper, and about checks routed to addresses that led to post boxes in different states. He had no interest in drama, but he did want clarity. I promised him anonymity and, more importantly, that his evidence would be used to fix things, not to feed tabloid frenzy. Armed with his accounting spreadsheets and a few corroborating emails, I built a packet that pointed a clear finger at Chris. It showed a pattern, a vendor ostensibly contracted for creative amplification that, in reality, funneled payments to a PR firm that phoned investors, and planted flattering profiles that bolstered valuation and justified round to funding. The money trail was patchy but meaningful. When stitched to the right testimony, it would look less like accident and more like design. I didn't leak it recklessly. I arranged for a meeting with an investigative reporter I trusted, someone with a record of exposing fraud without turning it into spectacle. I gave him the packet and the accountant's contact under strict terms: corroborate quietly, follow the paper trail, and when the story ran, let the law do what it was meant to do. The reporter's eyes had a look I'd come to respect: cold, pragmatic, and romantic. He didn't like revenge. He liked truth. The piece that finally ran was not sensational. It was forensic. It spelled out the routing, named the shell entities, and included a quote from the accountant that spoke of a system comfortable with moral compromises. The headline read like a coronation of fact. Investors called emergency meetings. The bank that had arranged a line of credit for C&H put its freeze in place. It felt like watching a building shatter its windows one by one. Claire called me that night. She left a message that vibrated with a thin, desperate hope. "We can fix this. Please talk to me." I listened to the voicemail 3 times before I called back. Her voice on the line was small. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not angry so much as bewildered. "What do you want from me?" I told her the truth as simply as I could. "I don't want you ruined for ruin's sake. I want the ledger cleared. I want people to know what you took. I want the people who worked and bled to be seen." Her reply was a long exhale. "You could have just left," she said. "You could have built a life without me in it." There was accusation inside that sentence, but also something that sounded like a question. "Why did you come back?" "Because you destroyed me and forgot to grieve," I said. The words surprised me with their honesty. "Because you made a choice and I had to decide whether to live under that choice or to break it." She was silent then, and for a wild second I pictured her sitting on the same couch where we once ate Chinese takeout, the ring long gone. She said, finally, "I'm sorry." It was not a confession, not a full accounting, but it was something. Then she asked, "Alting, will you stop if I tell the truth?" I almost believed her. Stories bend in the direction of what you want them to be. But the ledger had widened to include more than just her. People depended on clarity now. A few names had grown complicit, and a few had been used as shields. Stopping at a confession would be a mercy for some, and another injustice for others. So I didn't promise her anything. I simply said, "Tell the truth. And if you do, help me make sure it reaches the people who were hurt." She begged me to believe that her truth would be full. I wanted to, but I had learned to be pragmatic about promises. People bend language when it's convenient. They bend low when it benefits them. I kept my distance. 2 nights later, the stakes escalated in a way that proved how small our civilized boundaries really are. Someone keyed my car outside my building, the side door scratched into long, angry lines, and taped a single, typed note to the driver's glass: "Stop." I filed a police report. The officer was sympathetic but helpful. "We'll keep an eye out," he said. The note had a moral bludgeon to it, less a threat than a demand to capitulate. The message worked on some level. It made my hands ache to imagine what might happen to someone else if I pushed further. I thought about giving up more than once after that. But every time I pictured Claire at some awards table, her laugh lubricated by the support of a fabricated past, I felt a cold clarity. The project had become larger than my hurt. It was about integrity, or at least the appearance of it, and in an industry that traded on perception, appearance was currency. So I continued. I pushed the packet through legal channels, shared evidence with a regulator, and kept the reporter close. But I also started to keep my life smaller. I called my mother more, sat longer at her kitchen table, and tried to restore small things: a phone call to Tomas that wasn't about depositions, a message to Mara offering to help her find work. These gestures were tiny antidotes to a campaign that chewed people up. At the end of Part 4, the agency was limping and Chris had lost investor confidence. Claire remained visible in the press, smaller now, more human to some, a washed-out cautionary tale to others. The ledger still had empty lines. Subpoenas had not yet filled every blank. And I, who'd started this as a man with a single, pointed anger, sat in the dark watching my hands tremble as I scrolled through messages from people whose lives I depended. The deep cut had been delivered. It had bled into public view and made its stain indelible. But the wound it created would not heal simply because the guilty had been exposed. There are costs that exposure never returns: jobs lost, marriages frayed, reputations turned to dust. I had wanted a reckoning, and I had gotten one, but the reckoning demanded its own sacrifices. Standing on that morally ambiguous precipice, I realized the final act would not be about proving anything to the world. It would be about proving something to myself. Would I finish this by obliterating the last thing Claire had left, or could I stop and let law, not vengeance, determine the end? That choice would be the hinge for the finale. There's a moment after every storm where the air's too still, too quiet, and you almost believe it's over. That's what January felt like. The hearings had ended. The scandal had faded into the endless scroll of new disasters. And C&H Creative was little more than a cautionary headline buried under fresher tragedies. But peace after destruction doesn't feel like victory. It feels like the echo of a scream you can't stop hearing. Chris was gone, vanished behind lawyers and deal letters and whispers of relocation. Rumor said he'd sold his remaining shares for pennies and fled to Singapore. He'd always been good at disappearing when things got inconvenient. I wasn't surprised. People like him don't face consequences. They migrate away from them. Claire, no, she stayed. She rented a small studio on the east side, the kind of place where nobody recognized her, where ambition goes to detox. I knew because I saw her one evening, that purely by accident, or at least that's what I told myself. She was sitting outside a coffee shop, hair tied back, no makeup, reading a newspaper like the world had stopped revolving. I didn't approach her. I just watched from across the street, invisible in a crowd that didn't care. For a second, I almost pitied her. Then I realized pity was just another form of attachment, and I was done being attached. The legal cleanup took months. Regulators issued fines. Investors sued for restitution. Employees scattered across the industry like ash in the wind. Mara got a job at another agency. Tomas moved to Seattle. Most of them never knew the extent of my involvement. I didn't tell them. They deserved clean exits, not the weight of my motives. And me. I stayed behind, watching the empire I dismantled settle into ruin. There were mornings I woke up exhilarated, alive in a way I hadn't been since before the betrayal. Other mornings, I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if I'd traded one form of emptiness for another. Because the truth was, revenge didn't fill the hole she left. It just gave it sharper edges. One night, around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I should have ignored it. But some ghosts refused to stay buried. Alex. Her voice was soft and certain. Claire, I said. My throat felt dry. What do you want? I wanted to thank you, she said, for forcing me to face what I'd done. I almost laughed. That's one way to put it. I mean it, she continued. You think I don't know what I did to you? I do. I was selfish, scared. I thought if I could just keep winning, the guilt would fade. But it didn't. It just grew. You made it stop. I didn't know how to respond to that. How do you react when the person who destroyed you thanks you for destroying them back? Are you happy now? She asked quietly. That question hit harder than I expected. I looked around my apartment, the neat order, the empty shelves, the life rebuilt out of structure and silence. No, I said finally. But I'm free, she exhaled. Freedom's something. Maybe that's all we ever get. Before I could reply, she hung up. No goodbye. Just silence, of the same silence she'd left me with years ago. But this time it didn't hurt. It just ended. Weeks passed. The investigation concluded officially. C&H Creative was fined into oblivion, blacklisted from most corporate contracts. Chris's name disappeared from press databases. Claire's public apology made the rounds online, brief, raw, imperfect. She spoke of ethical failures and the price of ambition. I watched it once. Her voice shook. For a moment, she looked like the woman who'd once said yes to me on a floor full of takeout boxes. And I realized something that froze me. She wasn't evil, just human. And so was I. We'd both done unforgivable things, hers in betrayal, mine in vengeance. And in some twisted symmetry, maybe that's why it had to end this way. Not with triumph, not with punishment, but with two people, finally stripped of illusion, facing themselves. I didn't forgive her that night. But I stopped needing to punish her. That was enough. Spring came slow that year. The city thawed in fragments, puddles, sunlight, people daring to smile again. I started walking to work instead of taking the subway. One morning, I passed a park where a group of kids were chasing pigeons, laughing like the world was brand new. I stood there, hands in my pockets, breathing cold air that didn't burn anymore. Mara called me a few weeks later. "You hear about Claire?" she asked. "No, she's teaching now. Marketing ethics at some community college. Can you believe that?" I almost smiled. "That's one way to pay penance." Mara hesitated. "Do you regret it?" "Every day," I said. "And not at all." She sighed softly. "You sound peaceful." "Maybe I finally am." That night, I opened my laptop and deleted the last file, the one with every note, every plan, every email I'd gathered against them. The folder that had defined my purpose for 2 years. When the confirmation window appeared, "Are you sure you want to permanently delete these files?" I hesitated for exactly one heartbeat, then clicked yes. The screen went blank. And just like that, it was over. Months later, I received one last envelope, no return address. Inside was a small, folded note and a fortune cookie wrapper. The note read, "I kept this all these years. I hope you've finally found peace." See, I stared at the paper for a long time. Then I walked to the nearest bridge, opened my hand, and let it fall into the river. The wind caught it, carried it toward the dark water until it disappeared completely. That was the first time I smiled, a real, quiet smile. Because finally, the past wasn't chasing me. It was behind me.